Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're going to start. This is Raising a Bilingual Child, Strategies and Approaches. Our presenter is Dr. Fernando Naiditch, an professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the College of Education and Engaged Learning at State University. His research partly focuses on second language acquisition and literacy acquisition and development. And today he's sharing information on strategies to raise a fully bilingual child. Thank you, Dr. Nadich, for presenting for us, and please begin.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for joining me. I know it's Saturday, a cold Saturday morning, so everybody's at home anyway. So we might as well talk about topics that interest us. So just for those of you who don't know me, a little bit of my background. I myself am a multilingual learner, right? Uh, Former public school teacher, ESL and bilingual. Currently, um, as you just heard, my job is to prepare. I work with a lot of pre-service teachers at Montclair State University in our teacher education program, but I also do a lot of work in school districts with professional development for in-service teachers on helping teachers, giving them the tools and the knowledge and the skills that they need in order to address and understand and address the needs of multilingual learners. How did I get into this? Again, I think like many of you who are here today, I love traveling and learning languages and learning about different cultures. Um, I've been an educator for over 30 years now. And of course, I'm also a big advocate for multilingual, multicultural learners and multilingual, multicultural education. I myself, I'm not a parent of a child, a bilingual child, but I happen to be an uncle. And of course, I have a lot of friends who are parents of bilingual children and bilingual themselves. And of course, on that role, I end up being an advisor because I end up, helping friends on exactly what I'm talking about today, strategies that they can use to ensure that their children are going to learn the language, their home languages, right? And it is a challenge because uh, everybody who starts, one of the things that I'm going to start right away saying is that this work has to be intentional. It's not just a matter of speaking your home language with your child, but it's a matter of creating opportunities that you are going to make sure you are going to be consistent and using that language in a way that a child can actually learn from the input. There are different types of when we talk about, the name bilingual family is a very broad term. So what I am going to focus today on is, again, and I didn't include many references. I didn't want this to be very academic, but I want to, but what I'm presenting to you are actually proven strategies and basically what you find in the literature about raising bilingual children. So, of course, the first thing that people think about when they talk about bilingual families is two parents who were born in a different country and speak their home language. So the two parents speaking the same language. But you can also have two parents who were foreign born, speak different languages. Let's say they met here in the United States. And then you have two home languages, the language of the father and the language of the mother, right? You can also have the situation where one foreign-born parent is married to an American parent. So you have English on the one hand, and the language of the home language of the other parent. And there's also the situation when the two parents are actually native English speakers. There is, believe it or not, a lot of literature on that because nowadays it's become really common for parents, even though their home language is actually English, they want their kids to learn other languages and to also become bilingual. And this is also the reason why there was a boom since the mid 90s up until now in dual language education. If you look at numbers, you'll be surprised that dual language actually has exploded. And a lot of that has to do not with immigrant children speaking other languages, but with the class situation of the different of parents who are native English speakers, but they want their kids to become bilingual, right? Some of the questions that we need to address, right? Because a lot of people, are you hesitant about introducing more than one language to your child. A lot of parents don't have they want to do it, but they don't have the knowledge or the tools. And in many cases, even though we know it's a myth, some schools still talk to the parents about, uh, being careful on using their home language because it might interfere with their learning English, which we know is a myth, but it is one that persists. Um, and that's why people, are afraid of it. Because are you worried that learning a second language might actually impede the progress in the first one? That is the main thing. I mean, I actually, and I know that those of you who are here today, you have the same situation. You probably know a lot of families where even when the child does grow up in a bilingual environment, because of the fear, the hesitancy, or the lack of knowledge of the parents, many times the parents are going to speak their language with the child. The child understands it, but they will respond in English. Uh, and of course, another question I get a lot is, should I wait until my child learns English before exposing him or her to another language? I mean, as you can see, the questions are interrelated, but they just express basically the kinds of myths that people, again, repeat about bilingual education and multilingualism. As I say here, there's no need to worry. We know from research that the child's brain, particularly in the first 3 years, there's a lot of research in early childhood that shows that this is actually the perfect time from the very beginning for parents to start using their language. They should not wait at all. There are mothers who actually speak to the child or even read books while they're still pregnant. Um, there is a lot of research, particularly from the National Academy of Science, that shows that even babies as young as 6 months old, they can hear multiple languages and they can identify when the language changes, right? So from a very early age, as you can see, if you have two parents speaking different languages, or even if it was two parents speaking the same language, but they are also exposed to another language outside the home, they can identify the shift. It's a natural process, just like learning how to walk, right? And again, the numbers keep growing, and this is why this topic is so important. In the United States today, we have over a quarter of very young children who are learning a second language. And again, it does not harm their development in the first language. On the contrary, we already know we have a lot of research. I know this is not the topic today, but talking about the benefits of bilingual education would be another presentation because there are a lot of benefits. But we already know that knowing an additional language, speaking additional languages actually helps language development, particularly if you're worried about language development itself in terms of meta language and linguistic awareness. We know that those are actually helped by speaking multiple languages. So some important considerations that the parent should bear in mind. And the first one is to ignore the myths, right? Particularly in terms of speech delay or that children will get confused. We know that, yes, a speech delay is, in fact, something that is well documented in the research, but it's not speech delay because of speech issues. The speech delay is just because a child that grows up in a bi or multilingual environment is being exposed to multiple languages, and there is more input that the brain needs to process before it is ready to actually start using the language. That's the only thing that actually can happen. But it doesn't mean that this delay is due to some kind of learning disability or any kind of brain issue. On the contrary, again, we know that the benefits outweigh the whatever hindrance people might think in terms of learning another language, right? So there's again everything that I'm sharing with you. There's plenty of evidence and research to confirm all of that. But because of that, some parents get anxious that their child is not speaking, or they're worried that something is going to happen. But that's why the only answer to this is that you have to be patient. Language acquisition is a long journey. It takes time to learn a language. Even those of you who learn a language not because it's your heritage language, but you learned it in school or high school as a world language, you know that it takes time. There's a lot of ups and downs, and there's a lot of different factors that affect language acquisition and development, right? And of course, one of them is the amount of exposure that you have in that language, and specifically the opportunities that you actually have to use that language, right? But one of the things that parents should bear in mind, or caregivers should have in mind, is that you have to make it fun. Should not be a duty, right? It's not a chore for the child, but it's important that you create a climate at home that the child understands why it's important to learn that language, that it's actually uh, uh, good in terms of not only in terms of the benefits cognitively, but also in terms of the social benefits, including the idea of creating family unity. It is really important for children. I'm sure all of you can relate to stories, especially when it comes to the second generation of kids who grow up in the United States, that they actually speak English. They end up using English as the primary language or the dominant language. And many times they can even communicate with their grandparents, right? Another very common situation. The other thing that people are kind of afraid of is the language mixing. Mixing languages, again, is totally normal. It does not mean that the child is confused. It just means, again, going back to what I said initially, the brain has more information to process, more linguistic information. And while it's trying to still sort out, as I said, from a very young age, children can distinguish languages, can distinguish sounds, and can even distinguish speakers, meaning who it's at a very early age, children already know what language with whom they should be using, right? So the confusion is normal because there's a lot to sort it out while you are learning those languages. But it's important to actually build a strong foundation. And this is why I said that consistency is important. Another thing that we see in the research is parents that they, initially start very enthusiastically about, keeping their language, making sure their kids are learning their home language. But at some point, they end up giving up. And especially, this is particularly true when the child becomes verbal. The moment the child starts speaking, and they know that a lot of kids, especially when they start going to school, they are going to choose English as their primary language, which is very normal because every child has that sense, and every person has the need to belong somewhere. So it is very common. There's a lot of literature that shows that when the child becomes verbal, they end up kind of switching, into English mode because they want to make friends at school, and they bring that environment into the home. So that's why it's important to bring a strong foundation and keep consistency. Don't give up. Make sure that even if that happens, there are ways that you can keep using your language. And of course, as you know, everybody says start early. The earlier you start, the better it is, of course. But that doesn't mean that starting later, it's not good. You could start at any time. Of course, that the path, what we call the route of development or language development, is going to be different depending on when in terms of the language development you started. But it is true that anyone can learn any language at any time, right? And you know that even as adults, that is true. Of course, that the path of acquisition and many times the outcomes are going to be different. But in things that don't really matter, such as accent, right? That this is not important. The important is to learn the language and to be able to communicate in that language. And as I said, consistency is key. You have to make sure that your child has regular, and not only regular, but high quality exposures to both languages, right? And to how many as many languages as you have in the home. As I said, there are different configurations of homes that we refer to as being bilingual. A child could be growing up in a truly multilingual environment many times, right? If the parents come from different languages and cultures, and then they meet in the United States. So you have English, but then you have the other two languages. Again, the more in linguistics, when we talk about language planning, which is a way of, especially those languages that are dying out, a lot of indigenous languages or dialects, local dialects, that once the last speakers die, we're not going to have those languages anymore. We have already lost a good number of languages. And this is one of the reasons, right? Because a lot of it was never intergenerational. In order to create an intergenerational language acquisitional process, you have to make sure that it is intentional, there is consistency, and there is a plan. And this is one of the things that I want to talk about today, how to plan for it. And that those are the strategies that I am going to focus on. I'm going to go a little faster because of time, because I do also do want to leave some time for us to have a discussion or conversation at the end of our presentation here. So is there a best way to approach bilingualism at home? I am going to talk about, again, because of time, the three most well-known approaches to keeping language at home, right? There is what we call, there are methods and approaches. And when we talk about a method or an approach, what we are talking about is how parents and caregivers can go about implementing intentionally, right, bilingualism at home. And when we talk about strategies and techniques, it's what is it? How can you make it work? What can you do in order to actually implement the method or the approach that you show? So here they are, the three most well-known. Some, of course, if you read, parenting magazines, they talk about parenting styles. But in terms of language acquisition, we call them basically approaches to maintaining bilingualism at home. The most common one is one parent, one language. Then you also have the minority language at home and the mixed language approach. And these are the three approaches that I'm going to talk about because those are the most well-known ones, right? The one parent, one language is that, of course, in situations where which parent consistently speaks their native language to the child. So, for example, the mother is always going to speak Spanish to the child, and the dad is always going to speak English. As I said in the beginning, the reason why this approach was developed and exists is because of early research in early child education that shows what I said before, that children can identify patterns within the speakers, the people that they are spoken to. In the beginning, even though there is not much interaction in terms of give and take and learning a language, the child is still, is getting the input, and the child can identify where and who the input is coming from. The minority language at home approach is basically when you decide to have, it's more a contextual approach, right? It's not so much about, related to people, but to settings. What language am I going to use in what environment? The family usually has to keep or try to keep the heritage language at home, while the child is learning English at school and in the community outside of the home, right? What is it? It's really interesting. There is some research in what we call those those ethnic enclaves, right? Neighborhoods where you have a lot of immigrants who speak one particular language. That this was my case when I started teaching in New York, where I taught in a community that was totally Spanish speaking, right? So for many kids, even those who had been born in the United States, who would technically be considered native speakers of English, they actually only learned English the moment they came to the school building, right? So technically they would have been native speakers of English, but they're all placed in ESL and bilingual classes because of that, right? Because of the minority language at home approach. But you don't have to worry about that. It's not about better or worse. It's about also what is it that the family can actually implement when we get to the planning stage, I'll talk more about that, right? And there are, a lot of different ways of implementing. There are families now that are actually implementing the alternate days for each language, right? So one day they're going to use one language at home, the other day they're going to use the other. A lot of parents try to do that to make sure that the child understands, yes, we want you to learn English as well. So English is okay, but we also want you to keep the language. And this approach of alternating days actually comes from school, from pedagogical approaches, particularly in dual language programs. Some dual language schools, they divide the day into hours where they speak two different languages, like morning and afternoon, for example, or they have a balance in terms of the percentage of time that is dedicated to each language. But there are a lot of dual language and bilingual schools that they actually use the alternate day approach. You may have seen, like sometimes I put the posters here, right? When they put it on the door or in the school to the language of the day is X, Y, or Z. This is actually, it comes from pedagogy, and parents actually, some parents are trying to also replicate that at home, particularly the ones that need more support in terms of heritage language, right? Uh, that's the one that we said, the minority language approach. Now, the third approach is the mixed language approach. I like to call that the language association approach. And when I told you before in my introduction, when people ask me about advice or friends who have bilingual kids, that's what I tell them to do. And I believe that assigning specific language to specific tasks and to home activities is actually, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways of maintaining and developing bilingualism at home. I'm going to talk more about that. And in order to explain what it is, I mean, I don't know if you've ever done this, if does your family implement the chore charts, right? Usually kids growing up, they have little chores and you create a chart, to put it in the refrigerator, right? So, okay, so on Monday, Johnny is going to take out the garbage. On Tuesday, we have different tasks that are given to different kids at home. This family chore approach is also very useful when it comes to learning the heritage language. And I'm just going to go back here. This is what we call the language association. It's not only the chore, but each chore or activity or task is associated to a certain language use at home. So, for example, whatever make a list of the chores that you have at home, whatever it is, cooking dinner, doing and folding laundry, washing the car, gardening, cleaning the house, grocery shopping, looking after the pets, walking the dog, taking out the trash, recycling, cleaning up, picking up clutter, things that we all have to do at home, right? So when parents create that, basically, but the only difference is that between that and the chore is that the chore is basically a child does the chore, right? Go and takes the trash out, or clean up their bedroom. Or this approach, when it comes to to language, it's an activity that is performed with the parent, not the child by him or herself, right? So how do you do that? You create a chore or a chart that basically different tasks and activities will require different language. Because remember that different tasks also have different language functions that are involved and different vocabulary, right? So it's important to have a range of activities that you will expose your child to, because each activity is going to have also different language uses. And it's not just vocabulary, it's how you use it. So there's a different language when you talk about, doing laundry, or when you talk about cooking dinner together, right? And remember, together, these are activities that the parents have to be doing with the child, because the parent here is going to work as a mentor in terms of language modeling, right? Remember that language varies based on context, just like we were talking, like in the minority language approach, you have the context, right? Where do you use the language? But we also have language varying based on content. The language used to talk about cooking is different than the language used to talk about caring for your pet, for example, right? And this is why we see a lot that it is recommended that you may change the activities, the ones that you associate with certain language, about every 4 months or so, to offer the child the variety of input and the kind and the quality and the input that they're going to be exposed to. Remember, of course, input is important, but so is output. And the reason I like the mixed approach is because it forces the interaction between the child and the parent or the caregiver. Language acquisition needs both. You need the input, but you also need the output. One of the reasons why, in fact, a lot of people don't learn world languages, for example, is because depending on the teacher and the classroom that they are placed, they may not have the opportunities to use the language communicatively. So you have to make sure that you create opportunities for dialogue and interaction. And all those activities, they only work in terms of the language goal if there is a conversation going on while doing the activity. It's like, if you're, whatever, you're dicing vegetables, you were talking about that, you were talking about the vegetable. I'm going to show you examples of that. There is also the tell me what to do activity, for example. Like, so for example, you make a cake, you bake a cake with your parent, and then the next time you bake a cake together, the child is in charge of telling the parent what to do, like the steps. So you make it kind of also playful, right? And at the same time, it is recommended that you always, if you have personal stories and anecdotes related to the task, right? For example, you're cooking something that it's like a cake that your grandmother used to bake in Peru, for example. So we're going to talk about that and histories associated. Every time there is some kind of affective memory related to a home activity, it becomes more memorable and more relatable to the child. And therefore, the retention is going to be actually more long term. So let me give you an activity. Most people think that knowing a language is just vocabulary. It's not. Of course, it is the first thing that you have to think about. I put the example in English, but you can, translate that to any language, right? So you see, there's a lot of vocabulary associated with doing laundry. Think about a multilingual learner coming to the US and having to learn all of that. It's the same thing about your home language, right? But it's not just about the language that is the vocabulary that is associated with each activity in the home. It has to do with how you put that vocabulary, like what we call the language forms or the exponents, right? Things, how do you say things? I sort my laundry by color. I check the pockets for items. I add gentle detergent. I gently wash my delicates. I wring out excess water from the clothes. This is something actually, you see I put here like I hang the clothes on the clothesline. This is something that it's those of you who come from Latin background, South America, Latin America, that's very common. People don't use dryers as much, right? Because in most tropical countries, people have this tendency of letting the clothes dry outside when you hang them. That's the personal anecdote that comes into play when you talk about, well, growing up as a kid, we didn't have dryers, we did this and that. So, as you can say, what you were thinking about here, it's not just the vocabulary, but I put just a lot of examples of how the vocabulary is actually used, right? One of the later on in life, and again, those of you who are familiar with code switching, you know that it's totally perfect and normal. It's part of the way we communicate. But one of the reasons behind code switching is exactly the lack of that knowledge into how to use a certain vocabulary item or how to use a certain verb. Those of you who are familiar with Spanglish, you know that things like parquear el carro, or parquear el coche. You know that parquear doesn't exist. It's a hybrid form. You get it from, it's estacionar el carro, but you get the verb in English and you end up using the morphology. And that's a very intelligent thing because what you are showing is that you understand the morphology of the language. So you were exposed to language forms, but you lack that item. So you end up mixing it up. This is, I think, fascinating, right? In terms of developing literacy, especially early literacy at home, when I talk about that associating tasks and things, the other thing that's nice, I always tell parents, regardless of the language, even if it's English, you know how important the story time, reading to and with, not only to, but to and with your child, how important that is, that early literacy before the child is even getting the formal literacy of the language of schooling, right? So choose an activity that allows for that storytelling and for reading comprehension. Many parents end up using the bath, especially when you have little kids, as that moment, not just the bedtime story, but also again, every time we're going to have the bath, we're going to have a story, right? So the thing about that, and even there is research that shows that I put this picture to show you when you bring the toys and the bath is not really just it's not like adults that you take a shower 5 minutes and you're done. This is actually an activity, part of an activity of a child, just like playing a game. And the more toys you bring, you can tell the stories, have the child tell stories with the toys, but again, making sure that they are using the one language approach, right? This is actually very good. The research on early childhood literacy shows that later on, parents that intentionally and consistently do that, they are actually developing important reading skills. This is going to reflect later on in reading tests, for example, right? Because child is going to develop activities of knowing how to develop question and answer, which is extremely important. When you tell a story, you're not just telling a story, you're asking questions and discussing the story with the child, exploring the pictures, because there are a lot of important reading skills that can be developed early in life, such as the ability of the child to predict, to infer, use imagination, and even develop critical thinking skills, right? Why do you think the character is doing this? What else could he or she have done? That kind of thing. It's not just the storytelling itself, but it's the skills involved in the storytelling and reading, which eventually will also transfer to writing once the child starts writing. right? So this is one of the examples that I believe is actually very useful for if your focus is on literacy. Remember, practice does not make perfect, but it makes progress. And the more you practice, the better you get. And the two key words here are routine and consistency. So I'm going to talk again. Some of the ideas might be feasible for you, or maybe they may be not. Things that I have seen and done throughout the years with families that wanted to implement. And what I called here, now it's a personalized plan. The reason why I call it a personalized plan is because depending on the number of kids that you have, it has to be personalized because different children they're different, right? Different interests, different hobbies, different likes and dislikes. So that's another thing that you have to take into account, that not every method or approach that you choose, you may have to have more than one at home because it may work, something may work with one child, but it may not work with another child. So there's a lot of trial and error here, right? Try to also accommodate the approach that you use based on your audience. So it's your child who ultimately is going to decide what the best approach is. And you will know that by interacting with the child. So why do we call it a personalized plan? Again, different kids, they have different likes, dislikes, interests. So for example, kids also engage in different activities, right? So if you have a child who plays soccer, someone is in dance practice, drama class, piano lessons, those can be also moments where you intentionally talk. So you're coming back from the piano lesson, tell me about it in our home language. What happened today? What dance are you practicing? What style? What song? What music? And again, because children will have, and this is also good because again, you have going back to what we were saying before, there's different lexical items, but also different structures and forms associated to talking about that. In fact, there is research that shows that not only in terms of language, but in terms of like sports and art appreciation, when the child starts early being exposed to the arts, that's also very good for their cognitive development. So being able to talk about that in two languages, that is another plus that you have, right? Again, some parents have tried that, because kids sometimes they are resistant. It's normal, especially, and it's funny because they grow up and then they end up being those kids who understand the language, but then they respond to their parents in English. And so some parents but it's for fun, right? You create a contract. Okay, it could be a written or oral contract. Okay, every time we have story time or every time we do this chore or we'll do that, we will do that in that particular language. But once you create that, you have to remember that accountability goes, both ways. It's not just the child, but this is why consistency is important. You have to make sure, okay, every Wednesday dinner time is in Spanish. We're going to go to the kitchen, talk about the food, discuss, and it's going to be in Spanish. And you have to make sure that you yourself also keep yourself accountable to doing that. Even if you don't want to do a contract, you can still document the process and the progress of your child. That is important. It's kind of a self-assessment kind of thing. How am I doing, right? When you see how the child is responding, you see if you also, it's kind of an action research approach here. You see what's going on with the child and you change your approach or you adapt it accordingly, right? And that's one of the things that's very important when you do that. It's not just speaking the language of the child, but if you keep documenting what you're doing for yourself, even if you keep a journal or take notes about the child development in terms of like, vocabulary or forms, things that the child is now saying in Spanish that last month they couldn't or wouldn't. It is important to identify patterns. This is also a pedagogical strategy in terms of when you're teaching, right? You need to understand the patterns of where your students are getting stuck in order to make sure that you reinforce those points, right? So, for example, they had a hard time talking about, I don't know, gardening. Maybe you don't do gardening. So maybe this is something that I'm going to try and introduce more stories that involve that or whatever the topic is. Needless to say, again, routine is extremely, extremely, extremely important. That has to do with consistency. They provide the structure. It actually, believe it or not, people think that routine creates stress, but when it comes to routine in language learning, it actually reduces the stress, right? Because the child knows, okay, so this is the activity we're speaking in Spanish, and now I can go back to English. They know that there is like a quid pro quo in that contract, and it therefore, the time that you are going to be spending with your home language with the child is going to be more productive. And it's going to create more a sense of well-being, both for you and your child, right? The other thing about routine is that they create that sense of predictability, right? Which is actually very helpful, especially when there's so much going on in the outside world, at school today. The child knows that home is the place where they can actually if they don't know what's going to happen outside, they know what's happening inside. It's that idea of that sense of security at the same time. They do create consistency. That's why I said provide stability, develop discipline. They, believe it or not, they are actually support a lot of the cognitive function. They have a very good consequence here, which is the improve sleep and encourage healthy habits. Now, when you create routine in terms of language learning, you have to also document routines because there are routines that can be done daily, weekly, and monthly, right? So I'm going to share with you some of the literature about that. Daily routines, it's the initial step to establishing structure and consistency. So for example, I don't know, even if it's not in English, in your home language, if you have a quiet homework time and place for the child when they come from school, right? That's creating that particular routine is important because if you have to set the time, you save the same time each day, and of course, hopefully free of technology like smartphones and TV. So that's an example of a moment that you could create, but infusing a language. Not for homework because homework's part, but this is just an example of a daily routine. You always have homework every day. Something that is language oriented is that read together. And that is extremely important. A parent, if you want to keep, or a caregiver, if you want to keep your home language at home, even 10 or 15 minutes of shared reading could be in English, but of course, we're talking here about the home language, is extremely important. But then again, consistency. If you don't do it every day, it's not gonna have the effect that you would hope. So this is part of the daily routines. What about weekly routines? What we know is that the weekly routines, once you establish, right, the daily routine, the weekly routine will keep that bigger picture in focus. For example, one of the things that I recommend, which I think is really cool, is to go to the library together, right? Let's go every Thursday afternoon. It's after school. It's the time that we go. And instead of reading together at home, we're going to go to the library. And you can also create activities at the library, right? Choosing a book, all the steps that you can do, choosing a nice place where are we going to sit, what are we going to do? It becomes again part of that chore kind of thing that you have with your child, but it's a weekly thing. Again, some parents find it hard to keep because, life happens, but consistency is important. If you have those activities and your child knows that, that is also, it's like, oh, today is ice cream day. So today is library day. And of course, the third one is the monthly routine, things that you need to do every month. And the monthly routines, they are actually the ones that are going to engage that you have this long-term engagement and confidence. So for example, let's pick an event at the school every day where we are going to attend the event together. It could be any kind of event. I know that sometimes keeping the home language is difficult in those events because you go to the school, you go to places where, especially if you do the context approach, like the minority language one, where you use certain languages in certain places. But this is talking about the event with the child in your own language, right? And the other thing is, we talked about the library, but you can also choose every month and create other community resources. There's so much going on. Of course, libraries actually, particularly in New Jersey, some public libraries, they offer really great programs that people don't even know about. But there are other things going on in the community. Let's go and attend maybe an event in the community or an event somewhere nearby. And that's going to be the moment like we get into the car or into public transportation. And the moment we start, we're going to start using our home language, right? Another thing that is extremely important if you want to keep that consistency is that to know that you're not alone. A lot of families are going through the same and they also need support. So find that support group. And nowadays it's actually very easy to find, right? You can create play dates with your child and another child who speaks that same language and make sure that the play date is in that language. Of course, in order for that to happen, especially at first, if you want to create the routine, you have to actually supervise those play dates to make sure that children are using the language they are supposed to. You could have evening, like today we're going to have an evening in Spanish or an evening in as a group with other families. And I put ASL there because I don't know if they still do that, but for a while, for example, a lot of people who are learning and using American Sign Language, they used to go, I don't know if it was Tuesday or Wednesday evening at the Panera in Bloomfield, and they meet there. It's like their weekly thing, their weekly routine. They meet there to practice. Once you get there, no English, no nothing, just ASL, right? Uh, Family cooking competitions. Families get together. They all, they have a cookout together. They all cook something from their country because, sometimes languages are spoken in different countries. And if that's not the case, if you find people from the same country, you can have regional food or it's also a way to infuse some culture along with language, right? You can have the potluck night where everybody brings a dish. When you bring this activity of bringing a dish to pass is when you talk about what you associate with the dish with. And again, this is good when you have different families and you create activities not only for your home, but you create activities together with other families. So you are helping each other also in the process of developing a heritage language at home. One of the things that I actually did that once, and it was really cool when you get, especially if it is a movie that kids already like, if you have younger kids and they are watching one of those Pixar movies, for example, they already know the story, Toy Story, whatever, and you do that, but you choose the dubbed version into the home language. And then you learn to talk about something that you already know, but in your own home language. That can be really fun. And as I said before, the travel on the field trips, they could be part of the not only the weekly but the monthly planning. And you can do that with other families that speak the same language, right? You can do that at the local zoo. You can do that for Halloween. If you go, let's go apple picking, pumpkin choosing, whatever activity it is. But the activity again associated with a certain language, right? Some things to focus on when you talk about literacy. Help your child develop the literacy skills in your language. We are talking about bilingual, but it's also important to think about biliterate, right? Also exposing the child to reading, but also to writing, right? Learning to read together is a great initial start. It also creates bonding moments, and those bonding moments are associated with literacy development. But of course, it really works best if it is accompanied or supported by activities, questions. Remember all those reading skills we were talking about before. And it's important depending on the age. And that's why I said it's a personalized plan. Depending on the age of the child, as the child grows up, and once they start their literacy, their school literacy, where they learn how to read and write. In fact, a lot of kids do that even before they go to school, right? Oh, I don't know, maybe that's a good use of a grandparent if you have the option of having a grandparent involved to have like let's write together. And the other thing that is important to bear in mind, we were talking about everyday topics, but as the child starts going to school, or even before you can start, it is also very important that you introduce content area literacy in the heritage language, in the home language. Let's talk about math, let's talk about science, and that can be actually included even in those early activities. When you are in the kitchen cooking, there's a lot of science involved in cooking, so you can bring that because this is the kind of language that children are not usually exposed to in their home language, right? And I'll give you a quick example. I have a former student who is a science. He's Cuban American, and when he was given the opportunity to teach science in a bilingual school in Newark, he was so excited. And after the first week, he tells me, "Oh, Fernando, I thought I knew Spanish." And I joked with him. I said, "Of course, because your parents never talked about photosynthesis at the dinner table, right? This is not a topic. But if this is something that you really, but again, this involves a lot of intentionality. You really have to be intentional about it. The best way of doing it is to choose books to read together that talk about these topics, and then you create the questions and the further inquiring and thinking about it that actually helps the child to talk about topics that otherwise you wouldn't, especially when we're talking about academic topics, right? The other thing is information literacy, extremely important, especially because it is part of the Common Core state standards, right? Let's read the news together, whether it's a newspaper or a magazine that is in our home language, or if you're going to sit at the computer and in front of a screen, read a news item in our home language and talk about it, right? And of course, that leads us to the very important one, which is the literacy. Giving a child a phone just to get rid of the child is not a useful activity. But if you're going to give them the phone and give them a task, maybe that should be something that you could think about. Okay, so now we read a news item together and we are talking and discussing. Now I want you to find a news item and you read and you talk, and then you come and you tell me about it. And I also have the same homework, right? I'm also going to find something to talk to you. That's part of that two-way street accountability, which is important. This is not something that it's a chore for you. This is something we're doing together. So, uh, some of them we talked about already, the kinds of literacy activities that we can develop. Reading books, that has to be part of the daily routine, talking about them, going further than what's written, right? Playing, that's the other thing. Try to find, and there are certain, if you don't have it at home, there are certain organizations or even local libraries that do have resources in the home language that you can find. Is there a game that you have in your childhood that you play that you can teach your child and do it together? Is there a song that you want to have together, right? As you know, as soon as you can and as soon as possible, and the child starts the literacy, right? You want your child to also be biliterate. You can actually start infusing tasks that involve writing at home. It could be as simple as having a pen pal, or maybe if you still have family in your home country, sending a postcard, even a card, and then maybe a letter. I know this is something that people don't do anymore, but people still send, birthday cards, holiday cards. Those are little writing activities. That's why you have to plan. You have to think about where you could infuse more literacy into those activities that you're doing, right? And make sure, of course, that you keep home language print material in your home. Books, greeting cards, posters, magazines, newspapers, whatever it is, they should be available. Uh, Encourage them, right, to use the home language to tell stories. And this is why it's important to have those activities. You can expand the child vocabulary by teaching you words, right? When you go out for one of your weekly or monthly activities, pointing out, naming objects, even repeating for pronunciation. Uh, some of the reading tips, again, there are a lot of local libraries and organizations that do have a lot of resources. I know because, working with bilingual teachers, we always have to find, and there are certain language, like it's very difficult to find material in Haitian Creole, but but if you're teaching Korean, there are places where they have a lot of materials, and you just have to find those resources. They are out there. Uh, and the other activity, again, as the child grow older, there are parents that even that becomes more of a homework. But if you create, just like they have reading logs in school, you can do the same with your home language. I was a child that loved doing that, but again, not every. This is why it has to be a personalized plan, because every child is different and they have different likes, dislikes, and things like even activities that they are going to be more prone to doing than others, right? So I'm gonna round it out now so we can have some time to talk about it. Remember, consistency is key, right? Stick to your chosen method, even if it's difficult. And if that method, remember, we talked about trial and error. If that method is not working, it's like action research. Let's think about another one and how we can actually implement it. Maximize exposure, ensure that there is plenty of input in the home, not just from you, but also from materials, from books, from music, from videos, right? Opportunities for interacting. That's why it's important to have the support group, right? One of my friends actually decided that their activity, they found another family that had a child a similar age, and going to the park, like to play at the park, going to the swings, whatever it is, that was their play date, and the play date was only in Portuguese. Be patient because, again, as we talked before, language mixing is normal. There's a difference between language mixing and code switching. Code switching is part of communication, right? But language mixing is when you are afraid that the child kind of gets stuck telling that's normal and it's going to sort itself out, right? Because as I said, the child in the beginning, they can identify input, but in order for them to start output, they need to actually be engaged in opportunities to use the language. And in the beginning, language mixing is very normal because they are still trying to figure out how to communicate in the language, right? That's different from code switching, which is, as we said before, total normal and part of communication. This is important. The child is only going to use a language there is a need, right? So what is the need? Why, I'm sure that some of you may have heard your children saying, oh, why do I have to speak that language? I go to school, all my friends speak English. I don't need to speak that language. But this is why language is always associated with an emotional aspect. Your home language is also your home culture, is your identity. And those are the things that you have to start early, creating that need to understand how important that is. Or you can have a practical task. Listen, we're going to go to Chile, and I want you to be able to talk to your grandparents, to your cousins, whatever it is, if you have family abroad, whatever it is. Um, Oops, someone is entering here. uh, Keep a positive attitude. All of these things, they have ups and downs, and it's sometimes you are going to be tired. As I said, being consistent sometimes. And one of my friends, actually, at some point, she gave up because she was tired of trying. But if you don't try it, even if you don't keep it consistency, then the ultimate goal of actually raising a bilingual, biliterate child is not going to happen. It is a task for the child, but it's also a task for the parents. And that's why it's important to seek support, right? To connect with other bilingual families, to organizations. This is really important. All right. I think we have some time before we finish. So if anybody wants to have questions, I am going to stop sharing. But before I stop sharing, I want to thank you very much for listening. Um, the time goes by so fast and there's so much to talk about, but I hope that this gives you some initial ideas of things for you to try out. Here's my information if you want to write it down or take a picture. Again, keep in touch if you want to keep in touch. Our colleagues at the NJBE and NJTESOL, they have our information. So uh, there we go. I am going to Let me stop sharing. Where's my stop sharing? And I hope we have some time to have a little Q&A or conversation. I don't
So,
know who's
thank you,
what
Dr.
we,
Naiditch. I see one at right as of right now. There's one question, which maybe you kind of answered, but it's good for, to go through it again. What is your opinion about the practice of dedicating specific days to each language? You seem to
that's a
feel, you seem positive on that. Is that still the case?
that's a good question. I am positive about any strategy that works. Uh, so is it my favorite one? Honestly, not, right? I actually prefer the mixed, it is part of the mixed approach using a day, or it could be the part of the context. Uh, Again, this is something that comes from pedagogy, right? A lot of dual language schools use that. And because the schools use it, the parents sometimes they assume, oh, if they're doing it at school, maybe, it's a good thing, we should do it at home. I think it's actually more difficult, and sometimes parents that start doing that, okay, what languages today, I mean, like they get lost. So I prefer the association with the activities. I think it might work in a school where you have more of a set schedule, but home is more flexible. So again, if you want to, as I said before, I'm in favor of anything that works. It might work with one child or with not with another. So that's what it is. I'm in favor of it, but at the same time, I don't think it's my preferred strategy, to be honest.
Thank you for
And I see
coming.
some faces, Graziella. Oh my God, so good to see you. I see Jenny, I see Angela. I hope if I don't see anybody else that I recognize, but a shout out to all of you. Thank you for joining us this morning. Graziella, go ahead.
Oi, tudo bem,
Tudo
Fernando?
bom,
So
Graziella?
I want to make this quick because it's almost 12 and I don't want to, occupy so many. So I am very privileged and honored to have known Fernando in my PhD program. He helped me so much with my academic writing, seeing a Brazilian pedagogue in my program, and me being born in Brazil, raised biculturally here in America, an ESL student, the whole thing. So that's my history with Fernando. So you have a special place in my heart, but this part you do not know. I have 8-year-old twins, two boys, who I am raising bilingually, but they were speech delayed and I panicked, me, the expert, and I panicked. So now they have this great interest in learning Portuguese, and it's wonderful. And your, pedagogical genius brain, all your research today is helping me as a mom now. No more PhD student, but now as a mom. So, Fernando, yeah, I'm eternally grateful. I took so many screenshots, and I love the routines because they play piano, they have all these activities, but they call my parents, they call them vo and va already. So we have a lot of things already established. So this I just needed this, and I needed it to come from you, Fernando, to light a fire under me for the commitment and not giving up and just keep going so they can be bilingual members of society. So thank you, Fernando, so
Oh,
much, so much. And I'm so
Grisel,
happy it came from you.
you're gonna make me cry, Grisel. I will be in touch with you, and thank you for
Please.
sharing. I mean,
Yes, por
and
favor.
honestly, I want to know what you're doing. I did not know about your kids, so thank you for sharing.
Exactly, exactly. That's why I'm like, you have no idea what you've done.
Yeah,
Only,
and
only when I
just
was getting my PhD, but now it's a whole different ball game.
and just so you guys know, I mean, this session is being recorded, so NJTESOL-NJBE, they have a YouTube channel. So I'm assuming that at some point you'll get the message, once it's up and running. So you can keep this, Oh my God, to be continued, Grisela. I'll reach out
Yes,
to you.
absolutely, absolutely. Thank
So good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Beijo.
Okay.
Sorry, guys, this was a side note. So if anybody else wants to jump in.
There is a question in the chat about what you think about 1 week English, 1 week, let's say Spanish for school in schools.
Oh, in schools.
In schools.
Actually, again, if the person, I don't know who asked the question, but whoever asked the question probably is in a situation like that. No, I don't think, even pedagogically, I don't think it's the best approach. For me, even the one day, again, different schools, and I mean, I don't know if Lavinia talked about that before, but when you talk about the state regulations, New Jersey is a funny, funky state in what the way they define bilingual education. You know that people a lot of we use a lot of the ratio time, like 90-10, the different approaches of divisions of languages. I know a school in Hoboken that does 90-10. I had a student that was teaching there. So it was 90% of the time in English, 10% of the time in Spanish. And I told her, this is not bilingual for me, right? This is the other thing that it's important to have. So, and not only in terms of language opportunities, give both languages the same time and opportunity, but also in terms of privileging certain languages. If you are saying that it's a 90-10, what you are saying is that you do privilege English. Yeah, you can speak Spanish, you know what I mean? So I wouldn't even call it bilingual. The state of New Jersey does. So, policy sometimes gets in the way. This is why I'm not super a fan of the weak approach, because many times what happens, and I've seen that happen, is that when you start the week with the other language, you have to recap everything that you did the previous. Kids, they learn very fast, but they also forget very fast. So for me, the best practice, honestly, for those of you who are in bilingual schools, would be difficult to implement, but half a day, right? And I actually have videos, I do a lot of research in Europe. I have these videos that show schools that I visited that they actually have sometimes co-teaching with like a math class, but co-teaching not with the ESL teacher coming in, but the math teacher speaking one language and then another math teacher speaking another language. I mean, I understand that in the more complex it gets, the more expensive it gets. That's the other reason why sometimes schools try. And I also understand sometimes it's hard to find teachers. If you know anyone who wants to get their bilingual cert, we do it at Montclair. I'll be happy to have a conversation. one of my jobs that I do, it's not really part of my job, but I end up making it part of my job when I do professional development in schools. I try to recruit people that are speakers of different languages. Like I know, my students who are Haitian Creole, they have a very hard time finding materials. So in situations like that, if you're going to wait a week, that might not be beneficial. As I said before, context matters. I don't know what the exact context is, right? If it's a week each language, but the child has an opportunity to use the other language somewhere else while they are doing the other language at school, then it's one thing, right? There's a lot of factors to be taken into account. But as a pedagogical strategy alone, I prefer not to.
All right, so thank you again, Dr. Naiditch, for your time. It's been very informative, and I hope to plan to use this with my elementary parents in our
Oh,
school. I think it'll be very helpful to them.
that's awesome.
Um, is Kathy here? Are we ready for?